For more than 5,000 years, since the days of the pharaohs, Egypt has been a land of intense faith and spirituality. In many ways, it became a crossroads for some of the world's most prominent religions. Here in Cairo, the greatest Muslim metropolis on earth, one has only to listen to be reminded. The cacophony of modern life is punctuated 5 times each day by the Islamic call to prayer. Cairo is filled with hundreds of mosques of all ages and sizes. The great mosque of Sultan Hassan was built in the 14th century. It is a stunning display of enormous spiritual inspiration. But Judaism and Christianity have also found strength and motivation in this city, and their temples of faith are also here. The Ben Ezra synagogue was built in the 9th century. Legend has it that before the Nile shifted its banks, Pharaoh's daughter found the baby Moses on this spot. Cairo has numerous churches as well. Most are Coptic, a sect that was one of the earliest branches of Christianity. I visited the 4th century Hanging Church, where it's possible to sense the unbroken spiritual ties to Egypt's ancient past. If one were to find the look and sound of ancient Egypt today, then it would be here, at a Coptic church. The words of these prayers and chants are the closest clues we have to the spoken language of the ancient Egyptians. And the devout faith of this service is a direct link to the deep spirituality of pharaonic Egypt. The chants, the incense, the hieroglyphs still used in the Coptic language can be traced to an even earlier religion that began here more than 50 centuries ago. Today, Cairo's houses of worship serve as a tangible link to that time. A time when magnificent temples provided the spiritual foundation for one of humankind's first great civilizations. The power of ancient Egypt's pharaohs was rooted in a complex hierarchy of gods and goddesses. It was a religion that prized ritual and ceremony. The temple was its centerpiece, a place of wonder and mystery.
Temples were points of contact between humanity and the divine. And the Egyptians basically conceived of the temple first and foremost as the god's dwelling place. So the basic purpose of the temple ritual was the care and feeding of the god.
The second function of the temple was to physically represent the Egyptian concept of creation. Egyptians believed that the world began as a morass of primeval muck, a place of chaos and disorder. But from this morass, the gods pushed up a mound or island of safety, which became Egypt. To symbolize this mound of creation, temples were always built with a slightly raised section in their center. The temple mound reminded Egyptians that the primeval chaos could return if the gods were not happy. For over 3,000 years, fear of chaos and longing for order was central to religious beliefs of Egyptian civilization. The line between the two was very clear to the Egyptian. The desert was chaos and the absence of life. The valley, nourished by the river Nile, was security. The temple was the institution that kept Egypt safe.
The god assured stability. It prevented chaos. You know that in the center of that temple, the god is there watching over you, and that Pharaoh on your behalf is going to make the proper offerings to that god, and that the world will continue to function properly. The Nile will rise, the floods will come, food will grow. It's all a reciprocal process that continues throughout time.
Temples quickly evolved to represent more than a home for the gods. They became the focus of all life in the community.
When you think about the temple in ancient Egypt, you're really thinking about something that's much broader than a religious place. It's a religious and economic place, something akin to, say, a great monastery in the Middle Ages in Europe. It owns land, it has herds. These were great economic institutions within the structure of Egypt.
The first temples date from the birth of Egyptian civilization over 4,000 years before the Christian era. These earliest holy places were probably little more than walls of reed mats or animal hides. Later temples were built of mud brick. Amazingly, some of these structures have survived. The huge mud brick temple of the early pharaoh Khazakemwy at Abydos is over 5,000 years old. But Khazakemwy's great walls were the exception. Most of these early temples vanished long ago, worn away by the relentless desert wind. This is a mud brick. Nile mud mixed with straw, baked in the Egyptian sun. Every early building from the pharaoh's palace to the peasant's hovel was made of this. In the right dry conditions, these can last for thousands of years, like at Khazakemwy's temple in Abydos. But most of habitable Egypt was close to the Nile and subject to constant flooding. After a few centuries, this stuff just dissolves back into the Nile. And the Egyptians knew it. Now, that's all right for the houses of the living. After all, life is just a temporary stage. But for the tombs of the dead and the temples of the gods, they had to last. The Egyptians were about to become the world's greatest masters of a new material, stone. And with it, they created some of the greatest monuments in human history. We've seen the beginnings of temple construction in Egypt, and now we see its magnificent culmination. This is the Temple of Karnak. And after the pyramids, it is the most spectacular architectural achievement in the history of Egypt. It is the greatest temple complex ever built. It grew to cover over 60 acres, a space large enough to enclose the Cathedral of Notre Dame and its grounds. Karnak Temple sits on the east bank of the Nile in what was once Thebes, the southern capital of ancient Egypt. Today, it is the city of Luxor, some 450 miles south of Cairo. A succession of pharaohs built and expanded this great temple over the course of 2 centuries, some 1,200 years before the Christian era. This great collection of gateways and column-filled halls was built to honor a single deity, Amun, the king of the gods.
He is the great god, the #1 god in Egypt. Because of that position as king of the gods, he receives the favor of Pharaoh. And all of the great halls that exist in here, the pylons and everything, are built for him.
Along with his wife, Mut, the goddess of motherhood, Amun ruled over the capital of Thebes. It was Amun, more than any other deity, who served to legitimize and continually renew the authority of the pharaohs. In the darkest, most silent recesses of Karnak, the god Amun resided in the form of a statue. Surprisingly, the statue was not a huge colossus, but a small image that could be easily carried during festivals. The lengthy walls of Karnak were made of huge sandstone blocks. The construction challenges faced by the builders were enormous. Remember, we're not talking about cranes or even simple block and tackle to lift these enormous stones into place. Instead, the ancient Egyptians relied on dirt. Here we see the remnants of an enormous ramp up which the stones were dragged to their place in this huge pylon or gateway. As each course of stone was completed, the ramp was raised. When at last the wall was completed, the ramp was slowly dug away, and each course of stone was dressed with carvings and paintings on the way down. The great hypostyle hall is the heart of Karnak. Begun by Pharaoh Amenhotep III in the 14th century BC, the hall is a forest of 130 columns, which once supported a roof over 80 feet above the temple floor. Windows in the roof admitted light which flooded the dramatic central aisle. But the side aisles, so sunny today, then would have remained in dramatic shadow. 15 obelisks dedicated to the sun god Re were lifted into place throughout the temple. It took all of the engineering skill possessed by Egyptians to carve the massive shafts, drag them up dirt ramps, and carefully settle them into place. The tips of the obelisks were once capped with gold, so they might catch the first sunlight at dawn and the last at twilight. The glinting light from these shafts honored the sun's primary importance to sustaining all life. This great collection of monumental stonework was not erected by slaves, but by free citizens, for all Egyptians were expected to be available sometime during the year to work on the pharaoh's great construction projects. It was the equivalent of national service.
The labor that put these temples together is the common people. They're serving their labor time. It's their week to go work in Karnak. It's probably, one, we've got to pay our taxes. Two, we're working on the home of the god. This is a great service to the king and to Amun. We're ensuring the stability of life throughout eternity by building here.
Although average working-class Egyptians built this temple, they probably were allowed to enter only the outer courtyards during the festivals. These inner halls were entered only by the most elite class of priests, for it was here that the god's spirit was most present. Each pharaoh in his turn felt called on to proclaim his devotion to Amun, and while he was at it, his own greatness. The walls and columns of the temple functioned as posters or billboards, where the king's adoration of the god could be recorded and displayed to the world. Dr. William Murnane of the University of Memphis has been studying the inscriptions at Karnak Temple for over 30 years.
I guess my interest in this building starts with simple curiosity. I mean, it is so well preserved, and it's silly not to know very much about what made it tick, why it was built. I'm interested in what it tells us about the religious mentality of the ancient Egyptians. The only safe way you can begin to understand what the significance of a building like this is to understand what they carved on its walls.
Simple photography of the inscriptions is difficult. Over hundreds of years and a succession of pharaohs, carvings were placed on top of older carvings. Murnane carefully traces everything so that all the layers may then be minutely studied. For sometimes, these images are not what they first appear.
One of the things that you find constantly being emphasized in the temple is this balance between the way things are and ought to be and what's actually happening in the temple. And I think you see that very nicely illustrated over here. You have this bird, which is a hieroglyph for the common people of Egypt. And notice it's seated on a basket, which is another hieroglyph, which means all. And the bird has sprouted arms. It's not because it's a genetic mutation, but because this is part of another hieroglyph. Egyptians, seeing those arms outstretched, would think of instantly the word for adore. And in case you missed the point, the star, the five-pointed star, is another Egyptian hieroglyph that basically means adore. So you've got all the people adoring the king. Details like this have suggested that this was not just a symbol of humanity adoring the god king, it's also a logo for a basically illiterate society. And remember, after all, in Egypt, 1 or 2% of the elite knew how to read and write. So for most other people, something like this would tell them when you see this on the column, you can stand there.
A bird that's actually a crowd control sign is only one of the surprises that can be found here if you know where and how to look. The average visitor today might also be surprised that all of this drab stonework was once painted in stunning colours. The few sections of painted decoration which remain give us a tantalising glimpse of Karnak's fabulous past.
Parting this stuff is really urgent because, as you can see, the wall is flaking away. These name rings that you see above me were intact when we photographed them in 1992. They're practically all gone now. So every time I get fed up with the tedium of what I'm doing, I basically come back here and I remind myself what a race with time we're in and how it's important to record this stuff before it disappears.
Sadly, groundwater in Egypt has been rising since the construction of the Great Aswan Dam in 1969. Like a sponge, the porous nature of these ancient stones now draws this water and the poisonous salt it carries. But other Egyptologists are continuing the struggle to unlock more secrets still held within these wondrous walls. We're in the heart of the Temple of Karnak, the Holy of Holies, where the statue of the great god Amun was kept. The roof is gone now, but 3,500 years ago, this place would have been very dark and very quiet, with only the most privileged priests allowed to enter. Each morning, one of them would open the doors to the shrine of the god himself, whose statue stood just up there. Then the statue would be washed, given his morning bath, and anointed with precious oils, and then dressed in the finest clothes. Offerings would be left. Here, perhaps, flowers or oils. And on this great table, food would be laid out before the god so that he could refresh himself during the day. Of course, the god only took the essence of the food. After a suitable interval, the actual stuff was eaten by the priests. Finally, they would leave incense burning, and then the god would be allowed to enjoy his day in peace. The higher priests at Karnak were appointed by the pharaoh. Other priests were part-time laymen from important families. But there were many jobs at the temple that had little to do with its religious functions. Temples were not just the domain of royalty and priests. Hundreds of common people were required for the day-to-day operation of these huge religious centers. Farmers, carpenters, stonemasons, metalsmiths, potters, and many more were all employed by the temples and relied on them for their physical as well as their spiritual needs. Charles Van Sicklin is currently excavating the site of an ancient workshop that once served Karnak Temple.
At one point in the history of Karnak Temple, this was the manufactory. This was the place where they made the statues. This was the place where they made jewelry. They processed copper. In this particular area, we've got a lot of mixed signals about what's going on. I have places where I have concentrations of dirt filled with metallic flecks, which we haven't checked out yet, that look a lot like a word we don't talk about in Egyptology. The G word, which is terrible. Gold is the G word. Archaeologists hate to find gold because it's only a problem and it never tells you anything.
The age-old allure of gold has disrupted more than one dig site. For serious archaeologists, its presence only serves to distract from the search for more important discoveries.
There are a whole series of basins, one on top of the other. They go down for over 4 feet, and they were putting stuff in and letting them have sediments. The sediment would filter out, and then they put more liquid in and out. Maybe they were trying to extract some of the gold. That's probably the best theory this week. It's a problem I haven't solved yet, but that's archaeology.
All facets of Egyptian daily life were dependent on pottery. Jars, bottles, basins, bowls, pots were everywhere. It might be assumed that every piece of pottery is dug up and kept. But over 3,000 years of history make for a lot of broken pieces.
Most of this area is littered with literally millions of potsherds. This is a potsherd that I usually refer to by the Arabic word zabala, which means trash. It's part of the body of a piece of pottery, so it has no characteristics that will tell me anything about it. So we toss it.
As the centuries passed, the cult of the great god Amun withered, and Egyptian civilization was overrun by other cultures. Karnak Temple was finally closed by the Romans in the 4th century. When at last Europeans saw Karnak in the 18th century, its great halls were filled with sand. Campfires blackened the beautifully painted walls, and only peasants and their donkeys looked upon the holy inscriptions once meant for gods. But as the 21st century begins, Karnak is again filled with energy and passion, only now it is the passion of discovery and restoration. Today, no one lives here at Karnak. The sands have been cleared away to reveal these, hundreds of blocks of stone. With slow and precise detective work, François Lachet and a French team have achieved the impossible. From these random blocks, they have managed to reassemble a whole building. They have recreated the Red Chapel of Queen Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut was one of Egypt's few female rulers. In 1487 BC, 4 years before the end of her reign, this dynamic queen built a small temple just outside the walls of Karnak. Made of red quartzite, it became known as the Red Chapel. It was used for only a few years. For reasons we don't fully understand, Hatshepsut's successor and stepson, Thutmose III, had the Red Chapel dismantled. By the time Egyptologists found it over 3,000 years later, the only visible remains were a few large blocks of stone. François Lachet was fascinated by these blocks.
When I came to Karnak in 1987, I saw the blocks of the Red Chapel and I asked about it. And most of my colleagues were telling me that it was impossible to reconstruct this building because too many blocks were missing.
Lachet and his team set out to do the impossible. Fortunately, some of the stones which were once the walls of the Red Chapel had been carved to tell a story. Unfortunately, most of these stones had been reused in other parts of Karnak. The challenge was to find them and put them back together.
The first operation to be done for this study was to take around 2,000 pictures of the faces of these blocks.
The photos of the chapel blocks became a template for Lachet to work from.
It's like putting together a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. You don't have the box, so you don't have the picture, and half the pieces are missing.
The Red Chapel had been designed to hold a small boat. The boat was used to transport the god Amun in the important annual festival of Opet, held each year at the onset of the flood. During the procession, the boat of Amun was carried out of Karnak and paraded in front of the common people on a day-long journey to meet the king. At this meeting, the king paid homage to the god, and the god renewed the pharaoh's right to rule for another year. Scenes of this journey were depicted on numbered blocks, which had been set in the chapel wall. Once Lachet discovered some of these blocks, he had the key to understanding the order of each course of stone. If 5 blocks in a course were each 30 inches long, it was logical the missing block in the order would have the same dimensions.
The scenes with the shrine and the scenes with the priest carrying the bark have the same length. So it was quite easy to add these lengths to the missing parts to reconstruct a part of this entire third course.
When the puzzle had finally been put together on paper, it took only 9 months in 1998 to reconstruct the main portion of the Red Chapel. Sadly, some blocks were never recovered. The smooth plaster on these walls fills the space of those missing blocks. It will eventually be stained to match the colour of the original stones. Work still continues on the Red Chapel as some missing pieces are recreated by hand. But for the first time since the New Kingdom, we can look upon Hatshepsut's beautiful shrine and marvel at what had once been lost to us. I think it's fascinating to try and imagine the mysterious and dramatic scenes which once unfolded in this marvellous little chapel.
The one day in the year when the average Egyptian could actually see the god Amun-Re was the festival of Opet. The god would be removed from his sanctuary and brought here to the Red Chapel. Inside, on this very spot, was a small bark, or boat, which would carry the god on his journey. He was placed inside the bark, and shaven-headed priests with leopard skin robes lifted the holy bark onto their shoulders and carried it out of the temple of Karnak towards Luxor, over a mile away, down the Avenue of the Sphinxes. Trumpets blare as the god's procession approaches. Soldiers in plumed-covered chariots line the route. Spectators sing and clap as musicians pluck lutes and beat drums and cymbals. Dancers sway to the rhythms, acrobats spring through the air. And everywhere, the people cheer at the sight of the life-giving god.
Much of Karnak Temple remains to give us a wonderful sense of what this place was like 3,500 years ago. But the effects of time, wind, earthquake, and even vandalism have taken their toll. We must also look to other temples to help us appreciate the mystique of Egyptian temple design and the delicate beauty of their decoration. One of the greatest of these was built while Karnak was thriving. It was created by Pharaoh Seti I, the father of Ramses the Great, to honor Osiris, the god of the underworld. I wanted to see this very special temple, so I traveled just a few hours down the Nile from Karnak to the ancient town of Abydos.
It's Friday, the holy day of the Islamic week here in modern Egypt. You can hear the muezzin calling the faithful to prayer. What we have left of ancient Egypt is its religion: tombs, temples, monuments. But to the people of those times, that's what Egypt was. A living religion which directly involved the whole people. A religion which lasted with very little change for 3,000 years. We've seen the glories of Karnak, but to really appreciate it and to understand the power and the impact of these New Kingdom temples, you have to come here to Abydos. This extraordinary temple built by Seti I for the god Osiris. Few tourists ever come here, and parts of this temple have never been filmed. Our guide is Matthew Adams of the University of Pennsylvania. So Matthew, tell us about this amazing place. Where are we?
Well, we're in the first hypostyle hall of the Temple of Seti I at Abydos. And we've just come in from the sunlit world of the living of ancient Egypt, and we're moving slowly into the more dimly lit world of the divine.
So Seti I originated this temple. What was his purpose?
Well, from at least the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, around 2000 BC, Abydos was seen as the primary cult place of the god Osiris, the ruler of the land of the dead. The Egyptians believed that he had been buried here, that his tomb was out in the desert here. And Seti wanted to associate himself with the cult of Osiris. And in building this great temple, he was able to do that. I think that this is probably the finest relief carving ever done in Egypt. It's absolutely exquisite.
But take us through them.
Well, here we see the pharaoh, Seti I. He's holding an incense burner.
You see the flames from the burning incense coming up there.
Very clearly.
He's offering this to an image of the god Osiris, attended by various other deities. You see Osiris enthroned on a raised platform here inside a shrine, which is just indicated by these thin lines that encircle the image.
Where would this shrine itself have been?
Well, the temple had a number of chapels dedicated to various deities. One of these was dedicated to Osiris, and this image, or the image that this represents, would have been in that chapel.
Can we go and see?
Sure. This is the chapel of Osiris, and we see him in various guises here, with the king making offerings of incense and libation offerings, adoring the image of the god. It really gives a sense of what the original decoration of most Egyptian temples would have been. It would have been this incredibly vibrant and alive color. It almost looks as though the artists put down their brushes and left the temple yesterday. The images here help us a great deal in understanding the nature of temple ritual, but the Seti temple here isn't only important for Egyptologists to understand gods' cults and temple ritual, it also has a singular significance in Egyptian history. On the wall in this room, we actually have one of the most important historical documents from ancient Egypt. It's something that has been of immense value to Egyptologists in understanding the sequence of Egyptian history. It's a list of the names of the kings of ancient Egypt. It starts at the beginning with the name of King Menes. Here it says Meni, who was the legendary founder of ancient Egypt, and it continues all the way through most of the rulers of ancient Egypt, all the way to Seti, here at the end, who built this temple.
So it's an amazing stretch of history, isn't it?
Absolutely. This represents almost 2,000 years of Egyptian history.
And it's just a list. Is that the only importance it has? What else does it tell us?
Well, it tells us of the Egyptians' own awareness of the great depth of their history. Egyptology would have had a much more difficult time in putting together the overall outline of ancient Egyptian history without this document and others like it.
Although Seti I is the last name on this list, he died before his temple could be fully completed. It was finished by his son, Ramesses. But history will forever know it as Seti's gift to the ages, a beautiful monument to the deep spirituality and artistic greatness of ancient Egypt. In 1570 BC, 1,000 years after the Great Pyramids were built, a new era in Egyptian history began. It was called the New Kingdom. The great pharaohs of this period, such as Seti I's son Ramesses, possessed enormous power and prestige. They would expand and perfect an altogether different category of temple.
We're crossing the Nile at the site of the ancient holy city of Thebes. Just down there on that bank is the town of Luxor and the temple of Karnak. But it was to this bank that the pharaohs turned to create a new kind of temple. These were not dedicated to a particular god like Amun at Karnak or Osiris at Abydos, but rather they were mortuary temples dedicated to the honor of a living god, the pharaoh himself.
Pharaohs had always required a site where, even after death, they could receive praise and offerings. A suitable place where their memory could be worshipped on a daily basis. It was not enough for the body to remain preserved. The glorious memory of the dead king also had to be maintained, if he was to keep his proper place in eternity. Pyramids had spaces for such activities incorporated into their design. But when tomb robbers forced the pharaohs to seek smaller, more secure tombs in the Valley of the Kings, a need was created for a special memorial structure. The result was the mortuary temple, and one of the most elegant of these was built across the river from Karnak by Ramesses II. The spectacular temple he created is known as the Ramesseum. It was a fitting monument to the pharaoh known to history as Ramesses the Great. Its location, the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, was really an enormous cemetery complex covering dozens of square miles. The great mortuary temples the pharaohs built here were all very close to each other. Just down the road from the Ramesseum is Medinet Habu, the beautiful temple built by Ramesses III. And not far away from this spot sits another great testament to power and ego.
We're on our way to visit the most spectacular of the mortuary temples, a temple that was built to honor one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs, a pharaoh who was not a king, but a queen.
Her name was Hatshepsut, the same queen who had built the Red Chapel at Karnak. Initially, she was less a queen than the wife of a king, Thutmose II to be exact, but when her husband died, the title of king passed to a boy, Hatshepsut's stepson, Thutmose III. The boy was too young to rule, and so Hatshepsut became regent to command Egypt until the young king matured. But this remarkable woman possessed great self-confidence and abundant ambition. In the second year of her stepson's reign, Hatshepsut had herself designated king. She decreed that she would now be depicted not as a woman, but as a man, complete with the traditional false beard of a pharaoh. Hatshepsut's reign was peaceful and Egypt prospered. Trading expeditions were sent to distant lands, and the queen mounted enormous building projects. None were more ambitious than her construction of a temple to memorialize herself.
Nearly 1,500 years before the Christian era, Queen Hatshepsut began the construction of a temple to honor her reign. She chose this spectacular site, a natural amphitheater of stone, cliffs 1,000 feet high. Today, it is called Deir el-Bakhri, but to the ancients, it was the sublime of the sublimes.
Hatshepsut's architect was named Senenmut. Some believe he was also her lover. She asked him to design a temple which would amaze the ages. He did not fail. No builder in ancient Egypt had a greater sense of theatrics than Senenmut. 3 perfectly scaled terraces rise out of the valley floor and seem to meld with the towering cliffs which surround the temple. Carefully proportioned ramps connected these tiers. Statues of the queen were everywhere, and in the soft tones of the desert dawn or twilight, the temple's stones gave off a magical glow, which proclaimed to eternity Hatshepsut's sanctity and greatness. But fame can be fleeting. Hatshepsut's control of this wonderful temple was to be brief.
Work on this architectural masterpiece began in the 7th year of Hatshepsut's reign and continued for 15 more years. This temple was built in her honor, so her image is everywhere. Hatshepsut as pharaoh, Hatshepsut as the god Osiris. But although her temple is still here 3,500 years later, most of the images of the great queen herself were destroyed soon after her death.
Thutmose III became pharaoh of Egypt in 1483 BC. He was convinced that his stepmother should never have been pharaoh. So, as his reign came to an end, Thutmose did his best to obliterate the queen's image from her own temple. But time was the greatest enemy here. Later occupants continued the defacement of carvings, and earthquakes tumbled walls and columns.
By the 20th century, Hatshepsut's beautiful temple was in a sad condition. Paving stones had heaved out of line. Huge blocks from balustrades lay collapsed in jumbled piles. But in 1960, the Egyptian government funded a restoration project, working with a group of Polish Egyptologists. It's been a model of international cooperation.
Critical parts of the temple, particularly the third tier, lay scattered like a huge stack of children's blocks. The first task was to analyze these blocks and, one at a time, put them back into their places. We were granted access to sections of the temple that have been closed for more than 30 years. It was a rare opportunity to see the restoration work up close. Old methods are used to recreate the missing parts. Stone is cut from the original quarries and brought here to Deir el-Bakhri. Local Egyptian carvers are separated from the original artisans who worked here by thousands of years, but the care and attention to detail is identical.
Each one of these stones is cut by hand, placed by hand and eye, shaped to exactly fit. And then, after this one, they have to go step by step up this great ramp to the third tier. And for the first time since ancient times, it'll be complete. There's hundreds of men working here. You can imagine in ancient times, thousands working side by side in the heat to complete this great monument.
With funding limited, there is no modern machinery here. Instead, workers bend their backs to their heavy loads. To provide a rhythm, they cry out a work chant in praise of the Prophet Muhammad.
Like their ancestors centuries ago, they pull these great stones up the ramp using only their hands. And of course, these guys have got wheels. The ancient Egyptians, well, maybe they used sledges. It's still hard work. These limestone blocks are modern, but they're cut to exactly the same tolerances as the ancient stone would have been. And each block is a copy, an exact copy of what was here before. Like a piece of a giant jigsaw puzzle, a section of Hatshepsut's original temple is eased into place on its modern counterpart.
Piece by piece, Deir el-Bakhri is put back together. Funds for this work are difficult to obtain. It has taken over 30 years. But at last, the end is in sight. And we can again see Egypt's great queen gazing over her marvelous temple.
Each year during a special festival, the god Amun-Re would be brought here, to the third tier of the temple of Hatshepsut. The statue of the god would be taken in procession across this courtyard, back there, into a cavern dug into the mountain. There he would rest for a few days, before beginning his progress through all the temples of the West Bank. The public have never been allowed access to this place, but soon the work of restoration will be completed, and visitors will at last be able to stand here, on the sacred terrace, and enjoy a view of the Nile once looked upon by Queen Hatshepsut herself.
Like all ancient structures in Egypt, the great temples face many threats from time and the elements. Paintings continue to fade, inscriptions erode, rising groundwater threatens foundations and puts important carvings at risk. But through the work of many dedicated people, these great mansions of the spirits thankfully remain. They proclaim to history the unique relationship of Egyptians and their gods.
On the next Egypt beyond the pyramids.
I kept saying to myself, my God, I can't believe it.
What happened next is one of the great moments of modern archaeology.
A great pharaoh welcomes his children to the underworld.
It turned into the most incredible sight I'd ever seen in my life.
Hidden tombs unearthed after thousands of years.
Nothing like this has ever been found before.
Peter Woodward guides you through an Egypt few are privileged to see. Next time on Egypt Beyond the Pyramids. A lost city, abandoned by the Nile.
We have a royal fleet moored in the desert.
A murder mystery of terror and fire.
War, famine, and disease.
A tomb opened after 4,000 years.
Allison, we've got another body for you.
Now, Peter Woodward reveals startling new discoveries in the most ancient of lands. Egypt Beyond the Pyramids.
Mention Cairo, and most people think of a place like this. A timeless world where quiet lives are led behind walls and shutters, narrow streets filled with the smell of incense, and the faint clack of dominoes echoing from a drowsy cafe. Well, all that's still here. But there's another side to Cairo, which perhaps better typifies this old town at the start of a new millennium. We're at the entrance to Ramses train station in Cairo. Each day, 2 million Egyptians arrive to work in this busy city, increasing the population to over 16 million. It's a place of contrasts. Camels move along the streets beside flashy imported cars. The old mixes with the new. You can hear the Islamic call to prayer alongside Egyptian pop. As you watch these people rush to their jobs, it seems very difficult to imagine ancient Egypt. But just the other day, I saw the face of the pharaoh Akhenaten walk by. And over there sits an old man whose features are the same as Seti I. The ghosts of pharaonic Egypt are still here. It's just harder to see them. If you want to connect these people with their ancestors, then you have to get out of Cairo. Here in the country, it's still possible to glimpse the barest traces of the everyday life of ancient Egypt. A shadoof, similar to this one, has been bringing water to these fields since the age of Ramses. But the truth is, we know very little about the life of most of the people who once lived here. I don't mean the kings and the priests and the scribes, but the peasants who raised the food, the workers who built the temples, spun the cloth, molded the pots, crafted the boats, and manned the armies. The common people of Egypt were mostly illiterate, and so their voices from the past are harder to hear. But at least today, we are trying to listen to those voices. For the story of ancient Egypt is their story too. The source of Egypt's great success as a civilization was not the authority of her kings, nor the might of her armies. It was this: the rich black soil of the Nile Valley. Each year, like clockwork, the great river rose to cover this land and renew its vitality with rich nutrients. It was only this event that kept Egypt alive and kept the deserts away. As the life-giving waters receded, the farmers stepped back onto their lands, and Egypt prospered for another year.
At the height of its glory, ancient Egypt had a population of approximately 7 million, about that of present-day London. The vast majority lived on farms. The crops they planted and harvested not only fed their countrymen, they formed the basis of the nation's financial system. There was no currency. Debts, salaries, purchases in the marketplace were all paid with commodities, most often grain from fields.
Herodotus was very impressed when he went to Egypt and said, "Oh, Egypt is the gift of the Nile. Egypt is the gift of the Egyptian farmers. Without those farmers, it would just be a big, annually inundated floodplain."
Then, as now, there was only one river in all of Egypt, and it was the Nile on which every growing thing depended. All agricultural life functioned according to a well-defined cycle. The annual cycle began when summer rains in the highlands of what is today Ethiopia and Sudan swelled the river. As it entered Egypt, the Nile surged over its banks and deposited its load of fertile topsoil onto the farmland which kept Egypt alive. Generally, the river could be counted on to return the life-giving flood each year. But there were periods when the flood was too low or too high, and crops suffered or failed. Every Egyptian understood this peril. Their myths and stories, the very essence of their religious practices, all had to do with the river and its critical importance in their lives.
As soon as the inundation started to drop, you might say that all hell broke loose, because it became very crucial to start preparing the fields.
After the flood, the ground was lightly turned, then the seed scattered and worked in by the feet of men and animals. Egyptian farmers planted vegetables and legumes like beans and lentils, but by far the most important crops were wheat and barley. These grains were the basis of the two mainstays of the Egyptian diet.
Bread is something that everyone ate, regardless of what class you're from, and even now in Egypt, the word for bread is the same word as for life, aish. So to live is to have bread, basically.
While wheat was ground for bread, barley was raised for the other staple of the Egyptian diet, beer. Beer was consumed by everyone, but was largely the daily drink of the common people. Royalty or the wealthy favored wine. Grapes were extensively grown, and Egyptian wine was sought after by the connoisseurs of the ancient world. Papyrus texts reveal that although bread and beer were at all daily meals, the diet of the ancient Egyptians was varied and nutritious. Leeks, onions, garlic, lettuce and cucumbers were common. Fruits included dates, melons, figs and pomegranates. Although Egyptians didn't know of citrus or sugar, they indulged their sweet tooth with abundant amounts of honey. Farmers also raised cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, and donkeys. Although pork was common in the diet of peasants, beef was generally too expensive.
Work that has been done on zooarchaeological remains shows that obviously wealthier people, such as the pharaoh and his court, would consume far more beef than would people who were much poorer or workmen.
With the river being rarely more than a few miles from any Egyptian's home, fish was an extremely important food item. The river also created thick marshes, which were home to great flocks of migrating ducks and geese. Men, both rich and poor, hunted waterfowl with carved throwing sticks for sport and food. These wildfowl supplemented the domestically raised ducks and geese, which provided eggs, flesh, and fat. Chickens did not arrive on Egyptian farms until more than 2,500 years after the pyramids were built. When at last the crops were ripe, farm life entered the next critical phase in the rural cycle, the harvest. Wheat and barley were cut with sharp stone or copper sickles, then threshed by pounding the heads of the grain against a slotted piece of wood. The grain was separated from the chaff by throwing it in the air. Although women were not expected to work in the fields, harvest was the exception, and everyone, including children, pitched in. Most land in Egypt was owned by the pharaoh or the great temples. This meant that the joy of the harvest was tempered when representatives of the owner arrived to collect their tax.
We know that the ordinary Egyptians probably always resented the taxes levied on them by the state. We do find amongst the written records of the elite references to the fact that the tax collectors can expect trouble when they go to collect the sacks of grain from the farmers. And in fact, the tax collectors go with escorts, men carrying big sticks.
Then, as now, there were penalties for cheating on your taxes, although the punishment was far more dramatic. But not even taxes could take away from the satisfaction farmers felt from the bounty which rewarded their labor. Harvest meant that the cycle of life in the Nile Valley had wound through its season. Life in Egypt would be free from want for another year.
We've looked at what life was like for farmers in rural Egypt. But the ancient Egyptians had great cities too, like Memphis and Thebes. We're on our way to the site of what was once a thriving city here in the Nile Delta, about 100 miles north of Cairo. This place was renowned throughout the ancient world for its wine and its perfumes, but it has more questions than answers. It's a place of great mystery. We are heading towards the site of the ancient city of Mendes.
The city of Mendes was located on one of the many branches of the Nile as it fanned out into the rich delta. Today, farm workers plant rice on land that was once part of the great city. Mendes had its beginnings in the earliest days of the Old Kingdom and evolved into a busy trading port and important religious center. But it appears that at one point in Mendes' long history, the life of this city was interrupted by a mysterious tragedy.
Over 4,000 years ago, after 500 years of astonishing prosperity, the Old Kingdom dissolved into chaos. We do not know why. There is evidence here of people suddenly packing into the city, of burning and destruction, hurried burials, of whole families dying together. The classic clues of war, famine, and disease.
There are no written records here at Mendes or elsewhere to explain the decline of the Old Kingdom. But Dr. Donald Redford of Penn State University heads a team that is searching for answers. They are excavating an Old Kingdom temple built here in Mendes over 4,000 years ago. As they have uncovered more of this place of worship, they have also come upon a place of death.
So we're on top of the temple now, and
yes.
What was it you found in this area?
Well, we first got into a massive destruction layer. Someone had lit a fire at some time and fired the bricks, and they'd tumbled down in a great conflagration. And then under that, we found a surface associated with the structure, whatever it was. And on that surface, we found a big surprise. And one of the great surprises of my archaeological career, and a very dramatic one, in fact.
This is a really deep excavation. It must have taken you some time.
Donald leads me down into the deepest part of his work in the temple. It was here that workers uncovered startling evidence of more than just a fire.
At this point, well, right where I'm standing, in fact, we first discovered 3 skeletons, an old man on top of an old woman on top of a child in this spot right here. Then over here we found 2 more skeletons side by side. They had not been buried. This is not a burial because they lay in contorted attitudes, suggesting they had died traumatically and on the spot.
So the people who died in this place, men, women, children, were they trapped here? Were they prisoners?
It's hard to say. Actually, the walls confining the court are not that high, and they slope out. In fact, it would seem as though if they wanted to escape and nothing was preventing them, they could have. But why should they have all been herded here? This almost is sinister.
You think there may be more bodies here?
Oh, undoubtedly there are. I would dearly love to know whether we can say anything about the relationships of these groups, father or male, female, child, whether they're indigenous to the area perhaps, or whether they're foreign to the area. All of this, I think, could be answered, but it will take a long time and considerably more excavation.
Even with excavation, what happened here may never be understood. Was there a revolt or civil war in Mendez and these people were executed? Was there some unknown invasion and these were local citizens killed by the conquerors? Like so many questions in Egyptology, there may never be a definitive answer. We do know that after these deaths, life went on.
So after this disaster, the city and the temple seem to have been abandoned in some way, but then later on there was more building here?
Oh yes, it was sacred space for an extended period of time, and the temple was rebuilt in the New Kingdom, refurbished in the centuries after that, and in fact did not reach its full extent until about 550 BC. And I'd like to show you that latest stage, and in fact it's the largest and most dramatic.
Right. So this is another part of this huge temple, Don?
Yes, this in fact is the Holy of Holies.
That's really dramatic, isn't it?
Oh, it is. It's fantastic. It was the latest item to be added to the temple, and it is a great enclosed court with an indirect access so that you can't see directly into it.
So they wanted to keep it secret?
That's right, yes. In which there were 4 of these gigantic shrines. 3 of them were destroyed and have collapsed. The fragments still remain. Only 1 survives. Even that, an attempt was made to destroy, yes, but they were not successful, so it still stands, and it's the largest monument north of the pyramids in Egypt.
It's really dramatic, especially from down here, and there were 4 of those.
There were 4, yes.
Each with a god inside?
That's right, each a form of the ram god.
The ram god was held in great esteem by the citizens of Mendez. It was a symbol of potency and strength, which would ensure a robust prosperity for the city's inhabitants.
So this would have been the center of life for the whole town?
Yes, it was, in a sense, the focal point of the entire community. Everyone would have considered himself a devotee at various levels of the ram god. That was his god, his town god.
So this temple was at the center of a great city. How long did all this last?
Well, over, 5,000 years, I suppose. But we could have still seen this temple essentially standing in the Middle Ages. It was only after that that it was demolished for the stone, for the limestone in particular, and through the depredations of early archaeologists who were treasure hunters, the whole thing collapsed.
Birds nest in this place now, but 2,500 years ago, a god lived here. And after the dark night of Mendez's unexplained tragedy in the Old Kingdom, he again smiled on this ancient town. Mendez's greatest years were from 600 to 330 BC. The remains of the city's great walls overlook what was an active port on the river. Merchant ships from as far away as Greece brought their cargoes here to Mendez's busy harbour. Timber and precious oils were traded for Egyptian grain, gold, and wine. Today, the route of the Nile has shifted far away from this place. The once bustling harbour is now little more than scrub brush and sand. Donald Redford and I walked atop the ancient city walls, and he gave me a sense of the great port that once thrived on this spot.
In the middle background, where the line of trees is, you would have seen the river, the Mendesian branch of the Nile. But in the foreground here, you would have had the harbor coming in, a great triangular-shaped harbor.
So this was a real center of trade.
Oh, very much so, yes. There is no docks, as far as we can say. We found one anchor, by the way, in the excavations, which virtually proves that it is a harbor. And the ships would have been beached, a mooring stake would have been driven in, and then a gangplank laid down, and the porters would have come with their bales and whatnot. Egypt had so much to offer. It was filthy rich with resources that it acted like a great magnet on the peoples of the world. Everybody wanted to come here. Everybody wanted to trade. It was worth your while to even build a ship and go into partnership with a neighboring big man, if you were a Phoenician, and send it down here to Egypt. You would make a fortune.
In addition to the ancient harbour, Donald is also trying to learn more about where people lived here at Mendes.
Yes.
Over here on this side, that is the remains of the town itself.
That's the town. In fact, at this point, you see, you have prime land because it collects the north wind. It has a marvelous location. And so that it was occupied by major public buildings, maybe the house of the governor or whoever was in charge. If one were to excavate, and we have partly excavated over there, you would find great enclosures with rather well-built buildings housing the scribes and the elite of the community. In fact, you can see as we look that there are eroded walls still in place. And these could be plotted, and then we'd have a much better idea of these great public buildings. I would love to get out there, and that is on the agenda, if I last that long.
What strikes me standing here is first of all, that you have an entire city that you're digging. It's huge. You have temples, you have not one but two harbours. You have an entire town there that's been virtually unexcavated.
Right.
And it is also quite the most beautiful place, isn't it?
Oh, it is. It's very striking.
Life in Mendes was uniquely cosmopolitan. But in other ways, life here would have been very similar to that in most cities of ancient Egypt.
We do have an idea of what it was like to live in an Egyptian city. And they were quite congested. They didn't have broad avenues generally. They had networks of rather narrow streets, rather irregularly laid out. And the houses were nested together so that you had the large houses of elite individuals surrounded by the houses of people of much lower status.
About the only important resource that Egypt lacked was good timber. The wealthy could purchase lumber from faraway Phoenicia, which is today Lebanon. The poor made do with the trunks of palm trees. Just as in the Egypt of today, shortage of lumber in ancient times was solved by building most houses from mud bricks. The thick bricks made houses which were cool and quite comfortable.
I think from what we see in the arrangement of the houses and the layout and the scenes that they show generally depict that they were very clean and that they were maintained very well and also decorated nicely and often painted.
But Egyptian tidiness and pride in their homes did not seem to extend to the streets outside their front doors.
Sanitation was virtually non-existent, even in the houses of the elite. There's no such thing as running water or drainage or anything like that. And we know that the rubbish dumps that built up over time from the continual cleaning of the house and the discarding of waste and so forth, they were quite careful about keeping their houses clean, but the rubbish dump was right around the corner. You dumped around the back of your house.
Like the rest of their countrymen, citizens of Mendes were probably quite gregarious, congregating near the temples and marketplaces to visit their neighbours and hear the news of the day. It was in these social settings that we would have been able to see how much Egyptians cared about their personal appearance.
The Egyptians, like people today, were also very keen on how they looked. And, image, I won't say was everything, but it certainly played a large part. So the Egyptians spent quite a lot of time, it appears, on adorning themselves.
The fabric of choice for virtually all Egyptian clothing was linen, made from the fibre of flax plants. Although Egypt is today famous for cotton, it wasn't grown in ancient times. It was a linen that filled Egypt's looms and was spun into a variety of clothing for the king and his subjects. For the peasant, dress was little more than a loincloth. But for wealthy Egyptians, linen was amazingly versatile and could be fashioned into everything from beautifully pleated skirts to delicately thin shawls.
If we look at the art of the ancient Egyptians, we would think that the Egyptians usually walked around in rather skimpy clothing, enjoying a very balmy climate. And I'm sure in the summer and the spring in Egypt, they did dress very lightly. But in Egypt, the winters are actually very cold. And we can be sure, and there are actually textual references to this, that people would wear quite heavy clothing, robes and long garments to protect themselves from the cold.
Records found in the ruins of one village also show that long before the first boutique, Egyptian women had a sense of fashion and vanity.
I do think that the ancient Egyptian women were conscious of their dress, and one of the quotes we have coming up several times is women complaining that they don't have a thing to wear. And they obviously had something to wear, but it wasn't good enough.
Although many working-class Egyptians spent their days barefoot, getting around Egypt involves walking over a lot of sharp rocks and hot sand. Sandals were popular. The wealthy could afford to have theirs made of leather. The poor accepted straw footwear. Jewellery, even for the poor, was an important part of the image Egyptians wished to present. But no part of grooming and personal style had greater importance than makeup. As an actor, I couldn't resist seeing how I would look as an Egyptian.
Makeup itself probably started as a sort of protection against the sun. Both sexes used it, and most classes of people, from the peasant to the king, wouldn't be caught without it, even during the workday. Eye makeup had several purposes. It kept infection and flies away, and it was believed to have magical properties. It also reduced the glare of the sun, rather like ball players who wear black streaks under their eyes. Red ochre was ground up to create a sort of rouge for the cheeks, and it was also mixed with oil and fat to create what we would call lipstick. The Egyptian medicine chest had various deodorants, depilatories, even anti-wrinkle cream. Oh yes, most Egyptians shaved their heads, and quite right too. Bald is beautiful. It also keeps the lice away. But you wouldn't want the sun beating down on your head all day, so all classes of Egyptians wore wigs. The poor made theirs out of vegetable fibre. The rich could afford real hair, which means they probably had real bad hair days. Right, that's it. How do I look? Ready for a day of work or a night out in Memphis or Thebes? No, perhaps not quite ready.
In ancient Egypt, how people lived was often influenced by where they lived. Some settlements began near harbours, others at the intersection of trade routes, still others at strategically important spots along the Nile. But much of what we know about urban life in Egypt comes from the remains of a unique town, which existed wholly to support cemeteries. Those cemeteries were the legendary tombs in the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens. They were located on the west bank of the Nile, across from the great religious centre of Thebes.
We're in the entrance corridor of one of the many tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Each one of these great spaces had to be carved out of solid rock, and it required the labour of hundreds of men. Some dug and carried the rock, some drew and carved the reliefs into the limestone, still others painted the amazing scenes we see around us.
To provide housing for this valuable and skilled workforce, a special village was created. This workman's village is today called Deir el-Medina, Arabic for Monastery of the Town. Beginning in 1500 BC, this desolate spot was home to the artisans who created the grand tombs for Egypt's nobility. The spot selected for the settlement was anything but ideal. The relentless Egyptian sun scorches the site, and there are no trees or water. There isn't even a view of the Nile, flowing less than 2 miles away. But the location of Deir el-Medina had one thing going for it. It was only a short walk to the work going on in the valley tombs.
The people who worked on temples would have moved from one site to another right after that temple was constructed. But the Valley of the Kings was maintained for a long time, so the people who were working there maintained these jobs in their families and maintained the relationships, and we have such a full record of what went on there.
Archaeologists who found Deir el-Medina were fortunate to also discover an ancient rubbish dump filled with priceless information.
We're very lucky that they left behind their scratch paper, and that is basically this. This is what we call in the Egyptology trade an ostracon. It could be either a shard of limestone like you see here, or it could be a potsherd, broken pottery, and this was basically just a medium on which you wrote in ink, which is made out of lampblack and water. Fortunately, we found quite a cache of these things.
These small chips of stone are the remnants of records, diaries, and informal notes which give us a priceless glimpse into the lives of the Egyptians who lived in this place. No other city in ancient Egypt is so well documented. The workers of Deir el-Medina were highly valued and well paid. There is even record of workers going on strike to protest grievances.
The people who lived here were not slaves. There's this Cecil B. DeMille image of the royal tombs being built by captives who were then slaughtered to keep the location of the tomb secret, and that simply wasn't so.
Several hundred people at a time would have lived here. Workers were given houses which had been constructed by the state. The houses were organized along passageways which more resembled alleys than streets. There was very little open space outside, but the interiors were comfortable and even contained some furniture.
Furniture was sparse, and yet we have at least three tombs, I guess, from Deir el-Medina's cemetery that had about 25 to 30 pieces of furniture, mostly small wooden chairs and stools.
They clearly worked very hard, but working hard does not mean life was grim. The houses they lived in, although perhaps they were small, would have been quite pleasant places to be.
These low walls are all that are left to us of the houses of Deir el-Medina. Today they appear crude and inhospitable. But for almost 4 centuries, these structures were home to generations of workers and their families. Their home life might have seemed familiar to those of us living 3,500 years later.
It's the start of a new work week for the stonecutter who lives in this house in Deir el-Medina. In the summer, even the nights can be really hot, so the family probably slept up here on the roof. He'd come down in the morning and find his kids' toys on the stairs again, walk into this room, the kitchen, where his wife was probably already preparing his breakfast on the hearth here. She'd have got the ingredients from this cool cellar down the steps in the corner, and from the grinding stone over here. What's for breakfast? Well, bread, certainly, and probably cheese, onions, and beer. No, seriously, beer was a very important staple food for the ancient Egyptian. It was low in alcohol content and probably had the consistency of a soup, but you can't have everything. So he'd come here to this small bedroom used in the winter and get dressed. This was not a major problem, as all he had to put on was a loincloth and possibly some straw sandals, although most men seem to have worked barefoot. Then into the all-purpose living room. Now here would be a niche with the household gods, who would themselves be family ancestors. And over here, the seat for the master of the house. Now, these were skilled workmen, so their homes were probably quite pleasant places. Plastered walls, nicely whitewashed, matting on the floor, baskets, wooden furniture. Through here is the front reception room with this daybed in the corner. Shh, mother-in-law's asleep. Now, there'll be no windows in these houses. That's to keep out the heat. But there will be ventilation slots in the ceiling. That would mean that the whole place would be rather dark, but quite cool considering the intense heat of summer. All in all, it's not such a bad place for a workman and his family in around 1200 BC. So it's off to work we go.
As the men went off to their jobs, they left behind a fully functioning village. Boys and younger men were organized into crews who replenished food and water supplies from the valley below. Women stayed busy with household chores. They also frequently pursued projects to earn extra money. One of these was selling lamp wicks they wove for the lamps their husbands used as they worked in the dark recesses of the tombs.
This is the path that leads to the Valley of the Kings, just over the top of that mountain. That's Deir el Medina down there. Our stonecutter probably wouldn't see it for another 9 days. That's the length of the work week. During the week, most workers prefer to stay in small huts closer to the tombs in the valley. So perhaps here he would turn to wave goodbye to his wife and children in the village below, and then continue his half-hour hike to his hard work in the tombs.
Around 1100 BC, Egypt experienced a period of instability. Outsiders invaded her borders, and civil strife was rampant within the country. It's possible that the residents of the village felt exposed and defenseless to the dangers which surrounded them. After 400 years, the workers finally abandoned Deir el Medina. This place, which had been home to ordinary Egyptians for so long, was soon forgotten. Roofs collapsed, walls turned to rubble, and the village was at last overtaken by the desert sands. More than 30 centuries later, Deir el Medina lives again. Thankfully, its citizens left many records of their presence. They've given us a wonderful picture of the everyday life which flourished in this barren place so very long ago. The history of ancient societies is revealed in events most often dominated by men. So it is with Egypt. The records left to us detailing Egyptian civilization are filled with the accounts of male kings, priests, warriors, and scribes. But of course, the true history of ancient Egypt is every bit as much the history of her women. The role of women in Egyptian society was quite distinct from other early civilizations. Babylonian, Assyrian, and Israelite societies were dominated by extreme forms of paternal control. Even Greece, the cradle of democracy, treated women as little better than household servants. But in Egypt, it is possible to trace legal equality of women as far back as 2700 BC.
Women in Egypt could go to court, they could own property, they could be a witness, they could sign documents, they could leave their property to whomever they wanted.
I often have pointed out, especially to younger women, that the Egyptian woman, who was regarded by her state as a fully legal, independent legal personality, had more legal rights than some women in the United States up until the 1950s.
As a sign of legal equality, women, just like men, were expected to perform annual service, working on the tombs and temples built each year by the pharaoh. Women ground paint for tomb decoration, wove sandals and baskets for labourers. There is evidence that women even piloted boats on the Nile. Women did not, as a rule, have important positions in Egyptian public and political life. For the average Egyptian woman, the bulk of her responsibilities remained in the home.
The woman's work was in the house. And of course you have to remember that work in the house was not just the chores of taking out the garbage. It was almost a production industry. Bread had to be made every day. And the women were the ones who were on the millstone. And then the women were the weavers.
In the house, a woman would have to learn how to spin the thread to create enough to put on the loom and weave cloth for the family's clothing. And the process of creating even linen thread involves about 24 steps. So it's amazingly complicated. And a young woman would have had to master this and then learn to weave. And some of it is the finest quality that's ever been produced in the world. It's lightweight and like silk, almost transparent.
In farm families, women would be in charge of tending ducks and geese, but also helped in the field when needed. Women were also responsible for trading farm produce and manufactured items like baskets or pots in the marketplace. A woman's productive life began at 12 or 13. First and foremost, she was expected to find a husband and begin a family. Great emphasis was placed on having children early in life.
One has to start here saying that the Egyptian women were among the most beautiful women you have ever had. Long legs, small breasts, very upright stance, and you have these beautiful hips, long arms, almost dancers' bodies.
Courtship seems to have been very informal and surprisingly without much ritual or restriction. Relations between young men and women were also anything but prudish.
The love poetry seems to suggest that there was a sexual relationship before marriage in many cases, at least in the cases of the love poems, a young man, a suitor, would be visiting the young lady in her house, or a young woman would run out of her house to find her lover in his bed. So there's quite an explicit portrayal of sexual love before marriage.
Even in ancient times, romance was often expressed with music. Egyptians loved their music, and it was part of all aspects of their lives.
Sadly, we have no clear idea what Egyptian music sounded like, but we do have the words to some of their songs. This is part of a love song, sung by a woman to her lover, whom she calls her brother. My brother, it is pleasant to go to the pond in order to bathe in thy presence, that I may let thee see my beauty in my tunic of finest royal linen when it is wet. Fairest one, my desire shall be that if my brother cannot be with me tonight, then am I like him who is in the grave. For art thou not health and life? You know, they don't write them like that anymore.
Girls were eligible for marriage as soon as they reached puberty. Boys were slightly older, between 16 and 20. Although the courtship of a young couple might have been thoroughly romantic, the actual event of their marriage certainly was not.
Marriage in ancient Egypt was an institution, but not a sacrament. So far as we can tell, for example, there really was no marriage ceremony. A couple of families would agree that a couple should be married, or a couple might agree to marry with their family's support, but there was no real marriage ceremony.
Virginity was not a requirement of a bride or groom, but after marriage, fidelity was taken very seriously.
Once people were married, it was assumed that they would be faithful to each other, and actually, from what we know from the writings of the sages of the time, this applied to both the husband and wife. Fidelity in marriage was regarded as the proper way of life.
Divorce was not uncommon among Egyptians, and either partner could initiate the process. There was no social stigma. Divorced men and women frequently remarried. In spite of their attitude about divorce, the institution of marriage was at the very center of Egyptian society.
The ancient Egyptians often are shown with arms around one another, husbands and wives, and it's very sweet because it's not a huge demonstration of affection, but it's very discreet, and they both look very happy. The idea of family and a sense of affection and love for one another was very strong in ancient Egypt, just as it is today.
It's tempting for modern society to assume that technology has given us some unique perspective on life which the average person in ancient Egypt could not have known. But this sort of cultural bias denies the facts of the history of this place. It's very clear that the ancient Egyptians loved their country, treasured their families, and sought the same peace and contentment as we do thousands of years later. The basic elements which make life worth living were as treasured by these ancient peoples as they are by those of us who occupy our own place in time.
For more than 5,000 years, since the days of the pharaohs, Egypt has been a land of intense faith and spirituality. In many ways, it became a crossroads for some of the world's most prominent religions. Here in Cairo, the greatest Muslim metropolis on earth, one has only to listen to be reminded. The cacophony of modern life is punctuated 5 times each day by the Islamic call to prayer. Cairo is filled with hundreds of mosques of all ages and sizes. The great mosque of Sultan Hassan was built in the 14th century. It is a stunning display of enormous spiritual inspiration. But Judaism and Christianity have also found strength and motivation in this city, and their temples of faith are also here. The Ben Ezra synagogue was built in the 9th century. Legend has it that before the Nile shifted its banks, Pharaoh's daughter found the baby Moses on this spot. Cairo has numerous churches as well. Most are Coptic, a sect that was one of the earliest branches of Christianity. I visited the 4th century Hanging Church, where it's possible to sense the unbroken spiritual ties to Egypt's ancient past.
If one were to find the look and sound of ancient Egypt today, then it would be here, at a Coptic church. The words of these prayers and chants are the closest clues we have to the spoken language of the ancient Egyptians. And the devout faith of this service is a direct link to the deep spirituality of pharaonic Egypt.
The chants, the incense, the hieroglyphs still used in the Coptic language can be traced to an even earlier religion that began here more than 50 centuries ago. Today, Cairo's houses of worship serve as a tangible link to that time. A time when magnificent temples provided the spiritual foundation for one of humankind's first great civilizations. The power of ancient Egypt's pharaohs was rooted in a complex hierarchy of gods and goddesses. It was a religion that prized ritual and ceremony.
The labor that put these temples together is the common people. They're serving their labor time. It's their week to go work in Karnak. It's probably, one, we've got to pay our taxes. Two, we're working on the home of the god. This is a great service to the king and to Amun. We're ensuring the stability of life throughout eternity by building here.
Although average working-class Egyptians built this temple, they probably were allowed to enter only the outer courtyards during the festivals. These inner halls were entered only by the most elite class of priests, for it was here that the god's spirit was most present. Each pharaoh in his turn felt called on to proclaim his devotion to Amun, and while he was at it, his own greatness. The walls and columns of the temple functioned as posters or billboards where the king's adoration of the god could be recorded and displayed to the world. Dr. William Murnane of the University of Memphis has been studying the inscriptions at Karnak Temple for over 30 years.
I guess my interest in this building starts with simple curiosity. I mean, it is so well preserved, and it's silly not to know very much about what made it tick, why it was built. I'm interested in what it tells us about the religious mentality of the ancient Egyptians. The only safe way you can begin to understand what the significance of a building like this is to understand what they carved on its walls.
Simple photography of the inscriptions is difficult. Over hundreds of years and a succession of pharaohs, carvings were placed on top of older carvings. Murnane carefully traces everything so that all the layers may then be minutely studied. For sometimes, these images are not what they first appear.
One of the things that you find constantly being emphasized in the temple is this balance between the way things are and ought to be and what's actually happening in the temple. And I think you see that very nicely illustrated over here. You have this bird, which is a hieroglyph for the common people of Egypt. And notice it's seated on a basket, which is another hieroglyph, which means all. And the bird has sprouted arms. It's not because it's a genetic mutation, but because this is part of another hieroglyph. Egyptians, seeing those arms outstretched, would think of instantly the word for adore. And in case you missed the point, the star, the five-pointed star, is another Egyptian hieroglyph that basically means adore. So you've got all the people adoring the king. Details like this have suggested that
years before the Christian era, these earliest holy places were probably little more than walls of reed mats or animal hides. Later temples were built of mud brick. Amazingly, some of these structures have survived. The huge mud brick temple of the early pharaoh Khazahemwi at Abydos is over 5,000 years old. But Khazahemwi's great walls were the exception. Most of these early temples vanished long ago, worn away by the relentless desert wind.
This is a mud brick. Nile mud mixed with straw, baked in the Egyptian sun. Every early building from the pharaoh's palace to the peasant's hovel was made of this. In the right dry conditions, these can last for thousands of years, like at Khazahemwi's temple in Abydos. But most of habitable Egypt was close to the Nile and subject to constant flooding. After a few centuries, this stuff just dissolves back into the Nile. And the Egyptians knew it. Now, that's all right for the houses of the living. After all, life is just a temporary stage. But for the tombs of the dead and the temples of the gods, they had to last. The Egyptians were about to become the world's greatest masters of a new material, stone. And with it, they created some of the greatest monuments in human history. We've seen the beginnings of temple construction in Egypt, and now we see its magnificent culmination. This is the Temple of Karnak. And after the pyramids, it is the most spectacular architectural achievement in the history of Egypt. It is the greatest temple complex ever built. It grew to cover over 60 acres, a space large enough to enclose the Cathedral of Notre Dame and its grounds. Karnak Temple sits on the east bank of the Nile in what was once Thebes, the southern capital of ancient Egypt. Today, it is the city of Luxor, some 450 miles south of Cairo. A succession of pharaohs built and expanded this great temple over the course of 2 centuries, some 1,200 years before the Christian era. This great collection of gateways and column-filled halls was built to honor a single deity, Amun, the king of the gods.
He is the great god, the #1 god in Egypt. Because of that position as king of...
was its centerpiece, a place of wonder and mystery.
Temples were points of contact between humanity and the divine. And the Egyptians basically conceived of the temple first and foremost as the god's dwelling place. So the basic purpose of the temple ritual was the care and feeding of the god.
The second function of the temple was to physically represent the Egyptian concept of creation. Egyptians believed that the world began as a morass of primeval muck, a place of chaos and disorder. But from this morass, the gods pushed up a mound or island of safety, which became Egypt. To symbolize this mound of creation, temples were always built with a slightly raised section in their center. The temple mound reminded Egyptians that the primeval chaos could return if the gods were not happy. For over 3,000 years, fear of chaos and longing for order was central to religious beliefs of Egyptian civilization. The line between the two was very clear to the Egyptian. The desert was chaos and the absence of life. The valley, nourished by the river Nile, was security. The temple was the institution that kept Egypt safe.
The god assured stability. It prevented chaos. You know that in the center of that temple, the god is there watching over you, and that Pharaoh on your behalf is going to make the proper offerings to that god, and that the world will continue to function properly. The Nile will rise, the floods will come, food will grow. It's all a reciprocal process that continues throughout time.
Temples quickly evolved to represent more than a home for the gods. They became the focus of all life in the community.
When you think about the temple in ancient Egypt, you're really thinking about something that's much broader than a religious place. It's a religious and economic place, something akin to, say, a great monastery in the Middle Ages in Europe. It owns land, it has herds. These were great economic institutions within the structure of Egypt.
The first temples date from the birth of Egyptian civilization, over 4,000 years.
The gods, he receives the favor of Pharaoh. And all of the great halls that exist in here, the pylons and everything, are built for him.
Along with his wife, Mut, the goddess of motherhood, Amun ruled over the capital of Thebes. It was Amun, more than any other deity, who served to legitimize and continually renew the authority of the pharaohs. In the darkest, most silent recesses of Karnak, the god Amun resided in the form of a statue. Surprisingly, the statue was not a huge colossus, but a small image that could be easily carried during festivals. The lengthy walls of Karnak were made of huge sandstone blocks. The construction challenges faced by the builders were enormous.
Remember, we're not talking about cranes or even simple block and tackle to lift these enormous stones into place. Instead, the ancient Egyptians relied on dirt. Here we see the remnants of an enormous ramp up which the stones were dragged to their place in this huge pylon or gateway. As each course of stone was completed, the ramp was raised. When at last the wall was completed, the ramp was slowly dug away, and each course of stone was dressed with carvings and paintings on the way down.
The great hypostyle hall is the heart of Karnak. Begun by Pharaoh Amenhotep III in the 14th century BC, the hall is a forest of 130 columns, which once supported a roof over 80 feet above the temple floor. Windows in the roof admitted light which flooded the dramatic central aisle. But the side aisles, so sunny today, then would have remained in dramatic shadow. 15 obelisks dedicated to the sun god Re were lifted into place throughout the temple. It took all of the engineering skill possessed by Egyptians to carve the massive shafts, drag them up dirt ramps, and carefully settle them into place. The tips of the obelisks were once capped with gold, so they might catch the first sunlight at dawn and the last at twilight. The glinting light from these shafts honored the sun's primary importance to sustaining all life. This great collection of monumental stonework was not erected by slaves, but by free citizens, for all Egyptians were expected to be available sometime during the year to work on the pharaoh's great construction projects. It was the equivalent of national service.